For Chinese Studies webinar. My name is Jonathan Pettit from the Department of Religions and Ancient Civilizations. The University of Hawaii Manoa Center for Chinese Studies is a group of 40 professorial rank faculty specializing in Chinese studies from over 30 disciplines and professional schools. So our center aims to foster interdisciplinary understanding of China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, and other Chinese-speaking societies worldwide, as well as of Chinese civilization and its long connections to Hawaii. So this webinar series is open and free for all and is one of the center's main conduits to engage with scholars in Chinese studies worldwide. So today we'll have two talks, about 20 minutes each, and followed by a question and answer session that will be roughly a half an hour long. So for those of you should see both a question and answers tab at the bottom of your screen and a chat tab. So if you want to ask questions to our speakers as you're listening, just jot them right down in the Q&A tab. If you have a problem with the infrastructure of Zoom or something, a technical question, use the chat feature and we'll get right back to you. So today's webinar is the Chinese culinary history of China, bringing together two scholars in conversation with UH Manoa's own Dr. Nancy Stalker. Dr. Stalker is a Sen Shoshitsu 15th professor of Japanese history and culture in the history department at UH Manoa. She is a cultural historian of modern Japan and is the author or editor of 3 books, including Devouring Japan, Global Perspectives on Japanese Culinary Identity. That's Oxford 2018. She has also authored several other articles on Japanese food history. So without further ado, please, Dr. Stalker.
Thank you for that introduction, Jonathan. It's my honor and great pleasure to participate in this panel discussion on the culinary history of China, sponsored by the Center for Chinese Studies. So I'll be introducing the speakers and posing a few questions and comments afterwards. Our first speaker today is Dr. Thomas Dubois, who's a historian of modern China and professor at Beijing Normal University. After 2 decades and 3 books on the topic of religion, he decided to study China's food systems, a topic which has taken him from cattle ranches to cooking school. His new book, China in 7 Banquets, A Flavorful History, was published by Reaction Books in 2024 and is set for release in translation in both Chinese and Japanese. So please welcome Dr. Dubois.
Thank you, Professor Stalker. Someone else is sharing. We'll get the PowerPoint set up in a second. It's lovely to be here. It is replace current share. There we go. And we can't let you see the slides too early. Good morning from Beijing. Today I'm going to talk about a topic that runs through my new research. My new research, very briefly, is about cookbooks. Here is one, but I've got a whole bookshelf of them sitting right over there, and a whole lot more that I haven't bought yet. China's food tradition, China's food writing tradition, is really unexplored. This is something that I looked at in my China in 7 Banquets, and there is much more that I want to do that would really bring the tradition of food writing together. So China's food writing has been going on for about 2,000 years. It's diverse. It covers a number of different types of writing. So you've got medical books, you've got agricultural books, you've got cookbooks like this one that I've got here. This is from the Ming Dynasty. It's full of recipes. You've got people who just write about food that they love to talk about. And, where did I eat this particular dish, and who did I eat it with? This kind of thing. I want to see China's food writing, this whole big tradition over hundreds and thousands of years, as its own genre. And it's its own genre because it's a tradition of writing that speaks to each other. If you write about food, you've read about food. You've read about food from all these different perspectives in all these different ways. So if you look at food, from a really, really technical perspective, like agriculture, you're not seeing it the way that the writers saw it. They would have seen the whole big picture. And this is what I want to do in my new research, is to really understand food writing as a diverse and integrated genre of of prose in China. um, the big divide that I think we need to cross if we're going to understand the big picture of China's food culture and China's food writing is between technical, like farming manuals, and artistic. So this is gastronomic manuals. We have to see these as one single tradition. And a good way to see it, just for example, to see the integration of this tradition, this is what we're going to talk about today, is the idea of taste. Taste in English as well as in Chinese can mean a lot of things. It has a medical meaning in Chinese, it has an aesthetic meaning, and just like in English, it has a social meaning. And the key that I had, the sort of the door that opened that let me see taste as the common thread that runs through all of these different traditions of writing on food is they all share the same word, and the word is wei. So different understanding, different meaning, different integrated meanings of the word wei is going to be the topic of today's talk. And we're going to focus on two types, the medical meaning and the aesthetic meaning, and how these two meanings interact. The first meaning, we're going to just very briefly look at the two meanings, medical and aesthetic, and then look at the interaction. The first meaning is medical. And the term that I want to focus on here is what's called 本味, true taste, or original taste. And this term shows up in around the 3rd century BC in medical writings, among which, for example, we have this book called the 李氏春秋, written by Lü Wei, and it is it's sort of a proto-Taoist book, and it talks about everything like early books often do. It talks about philosophy, it talks about the natural world, and it talks about politics in particular. And it keeps using this term true taste. And what do they mean when we're talking about a political treatise? Why are we talking about food in a political treatise? Well, we have this very early writer called Ian. He is famous as a cook. He's the man on the right. And if you look carefully at the picture on the right, right next to him, this is the one in black and white. This is a rubbing from a stone stele. He has a little pot next to him. Now that is not a coincidence. That is not just the fact that he couldn't clear out his house before they drew a picture of him. This is because he is known for two things. Ian is both a cook and a political thinker. So this is a crossover that we're going to see repeatedly. Um, he talks about in this chapter, in this early book, he talks about true taste in a metaphoric sense. So the man you see on the right, he's an early Shang king called Shang Tang, and he is asking the great question of politics: how do I get better people to come and work for me? How do I get talented people to join my government?
Hey, Thomas,
And
real quick, are you sharing your screen? Because we're,
oh, pardon me.
oh, I
I,
just want to make sure. I know you
thank
wanted to
you.
wait, but I didn't want to wait too long.
No. Thank you. And I'm going to go back because I love this first slide as well. Um, I apologize for that.
All right.
The screen sharing is a two-step process, and I only did step one. So again, just very briefly, I'm going to talk about taste and taste in the different meanings and how these different meanings not overlap, how they interact, medical, aesthetic, and social. Okay, true taste, 本味. This is a term that comes out of political writing, and it comes out of very old political writing from the 3rd, 4th, 2nd centuries BC. The first time we hear it is in this book called the 历史春秋, named after the author Lü Wei. And he records a dialogue between a political thinker who is also a cook and a political figure, the king, who has the great question of the day, how do I get people to work for me? And the answer that comes from this political thinker slash cook is this. Um, there are many different animals in the world. They all have different tasting meat. If you get it from the water, it tastes fishy. If you get it from the land, it tastes rank. If you get a ruminant like a sheep or a cow, it tastes gamey. But if you cook it the correct way, you can get a good taste out of any kind of meat. And of course, this is a metaphor for what? For finding the kind of people that you want and then treating them in the right way to get the best talent out of them. But it starts with this idea, the metaphor is of true taste. And true taste in this case means inherent nature. And this connects to a bigger theory of 5 flavors. The 5 flavors are the ones you see on the screen: salty, sour, bitter, spicy, and sweet. And the 5 flavors, what you need to know about them, they are mentioned in this early text. They are still heard today. So all of the medical texts, this is a long tradition. It goes on for 2,500 years. They still refer to these 5 tastes, these 5 basic tastes. The thing you need to know about the theory of 5 flavors is that it's cyclical. So we often think about nutrition kind of on a sliding scale. You have too much of something or you don't have enough of something. Um, the Chinese version, the 5 flavors theory, is that everything leads to something else. So it's not a binary, it's a pentad. The other thing you need to know is that it's correlative. So when you talk about one taste, you're talking about a lot of different phenomena that all come in 5s. And each of these 5s, you could think of it like a column, they all relate to each other. So for example, just talking about nutrition, sour, this one taste, the question, how does it enter? It enters the body through the liver. Why do we talk about the liver? Because that's also another grouping of 5. It enters through the liver, it fears wind, it travels through the tendons, and if you have too much sour, you get a particular physical response. Each of these categories comes in groups of 5. So you also have color, you also have temperature, you also have a star, you also have a planet, on and on and on. All of the phenomena of the universe are connected to each other and they all come in these groups of 5s. So what that means is flavor is connected to not just your body, but the entire universe. And so when you see the theory of 5 tastes, it actually becomes really complicated very quickly because every phenomenon, all of these different tastes relate to something else. And this is just a picture of how it relates to your health, but it's much bigger than that. Um, so that's the medical. I just wanted to very quickly go through the medical meaning of taste, or the medicalized meaning of taste. That's one. We're going to put that on the table and leave it on the side. The second is social or aesthetic. What makes food desirable? And this doesn't have a theory. 5 flavors is a theory. This is more just markers that gets put into different kinds of food writing, and the aesthetic and social markers overlap. So how do we know good food? When we talk about good food, we talk about it being balanced. We talk about respect for the materials. We talk about using restraint in spicing or cooking. And this, again, is very similar to the way we talked about food as a metaphor for people, that it's you want to find the inherent nature. You want to find the, the, um, the nature that can then be made into something better through cooking or through training. But you still have to respect that basic nature. And you talk about it being in season. So 不是不是, this is a Confucian ideal that you only eat the foods in season, not because they're tasty, but because that's what heaven, that's what the universe gives you, and you should go with the flow of heaven. So these are markers that you see that describe good food. They also describe good people, and they also describe the relationship between good people and good food. That's why they're both aesthetic and social at the same time. And they also use this term weight, they use this term flavor. So it's a medical meaning, it's an aesthetic meaning, it's a social meaning, all in the same tradition of writing. Now, how do these overlap? Let's look at uh, a poem. This is a poem from about the 3rd century BC. This would have been a ritual that you did at funerals. And it's a long, long poem that would have been sung or would have been recited. And you take the soul of the deceased and you tell them all the things they're going to miss when they leave. So you talk about beautiful house, beautiful women, beautiful hunting, weapons, all of these things that you would like. And you talk about food. And you describe this beautiful banquet to get the soul to come back. Now, here's the menu. It's translated back in the 50s, so it's a little bit odd. We talked about seethed duck. That took me, or seethed turtle. That took me a long time to figure out. I changed it a little bit. Um, the menu is here. If you look at it on the surface, this looks like just, a fancy meal. But we're looking at the different ways that these ideas of taste interact with each other. What would it mean that all this goes into a poem? And if you look at it carefully, the menu is structured like a poem. So just like you would rhyme in a poem, you have all of these different phenomena that are interacting in a poetic manner. So you have couplets, you have progression that happens logically, um, so you have sea animals, and on the other hand, you have land animals. You have a dry cooking, and on the other side, you have a wet cooking. You have the 5 tastes that we just talked about, and then a couplet with that is the 5 grains. And the point that I want to make with this is the way you think about food is inseparable from the way you read about food. So the aesthetic sense of taste is tied to your identity or tied to your ideal or tied to your aesthetic as a poetic person, as a cultured person. That's one example. Another example is this very famous man, Yuan Mei, who wrote the book, The Recipes from the Garden of Contentment. It's now in a very, very good English translation. I recommend it highly. He is the famous gastronome. He's from the 1800s in China, Qing Dynasty, so a much later figure, and he wrote about food that he loves from the perspective of a literary cultured person. And what did he see? He talked about food in this famous book that I have. Oh, look at that. I have it right over here. Famous book that's sort of the manual for a Chinese cultured gastronome. What does beautiful food mean to him? It has a lot of different, again, these aesthetic and social markers. He sees, for example, restraint. And he writes about restraint in terms of classical literature. So he's talking to other scholars in the language of a scholar, but he's also giving this idea that taste is something that you learn. You're not born with a sense of taste. You have to develop it. And this is, again, the fundamental ideal of Chinese scholars that you develop yourself aesthetically and morally. Um, Restraint, balance, flavor, respect for materials. These are all written into the aesthetics of a cultured person, but they're written in a way that is also showing status and learning and the aesthetic of being a learned person. So this is just a very, very quickly going through some of the things that I've found when you look at food writing on the big picture level. You can't just take one piece of it. You can't do what cookbooks do and say, everybody likes to eat spicy food. That's not the way people would have thought about food. Any Chinese person then, or any Chinese person now, when they think about food, they have all of these different meanings in mind, what it does to your body, how it reflects your status as a person, and why it tastes good. All of these things interact. So it's much more than the food on the plate. It's also a structure that is in many ways invisible, but always present to the people who are going to be dining. It's very present, it's a very prevalent structure, and it's also very visible in every meal that you eat. It's legible. So that's all I've got to say about taste. There's so much more that I wish I could say, and it will come out in another book. That's all I've got.
Thank you, Professor Dubois. I'm assuming we're going to do both of the talks back to back and then open up for questions.
That'd be great.
Okay, so the second speaker today is Jin Feng, a professor of Chinese and Japanese, and the Orville and Mary Patterson Rout Professor of Literature at Grinnell College. She has published 5 English monographs: The New Woman in 20th Century Chinese Fiction from 2004, The Making of a Family Saga, 2009, Romancing the Internet in 2013, Tasting Paradise on Earth in 2019, and The Trans-Pacific Flow from last year. And 3 Chinese books, including a book for foodies, which I won't be able to pronounce in Chinese, I'm sorry, and numerous other articles in English and Chinese. So welcome, Professor Feng. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you for the kind introduction. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint now, so I hope it works. It's always a little nerve-wracking to do it online. So, all right, I guess you can see it, right? Okay. So, okay. So it's a great pleasure for me to be able to participate in this excellent webinar. Thomas's presentation was fascinating, and it's a very hard action to follow. In any ways, the title of my presentation today is Eat Bitterness, Process Trauma, 2 novels by Wang Anyi and Ge Liang. Eat Bitterness obviously is a very bad direct translation of the Chinese phrase 吃苦, or to endure hardship, to endure challenges. So that relates to today's talk. So I will try to start by situating my presentation a little bit in my scholarship and teaching of Chinese foodways first. Then we'll be introducing 2 concepts that I found useful for the analysis of these 2 novels. So as Professor Stalker already mentioned, I wrote a Chinese language book, which is not scholarly. It's just a collection of essays called 吃货之书, which is pictured on the left here, that came out in 2020. On the right hand is my English monograph, Tasting Paradise on Earth, that came out from University of Washington Press in 2019, in which I discusses the phenomenon of food nostalgia in contemporary China, basically how historical restaurants try to rebrand themselves to appeal to middle-class Chinese people in a market-oriented economy. I also teach on Chinese food. Here's a picture taken in Nanjing, China in March 2017. That time I was team teaching with a colleague in the Russian department at Grinnell College, and we took our first-year students, 15 of them, to China first for 2 weeks in March, and then to Russia in May of 2017. So this is a picture taken at a famous Nanjing restaurant called Da Tai Dang. Some of you may have already visited it. Well, basically, it's gentrified street food, part of the food nostalgia industry, I would say. In any ways, I want to mention my research and the teaching of Chinese foodways because I wanted to suggest that learning Chinese food from multiple disciplines to adopt interdisciplinary approaches can always be fruitful. For myself, I've adopted methods from literary studies, historical inquiries, and ethnographic fieldworks to learn about Chinese foodways. So even though my talk today is apparently about literature, about 2 novels, it actually can show its connection to history, to society, to culture, to show how Chinese people use foodways in their daily lives. So anyhow, the 2 novels I'm discussing today is one, The Knife and the Words, 一把刀千个字 by Wang Anyi, that came out in 2021. And the second novel is Food is Heaven, or 厌食记 by Ge Liang, which came out in 2022. Just one word about the two authors. Hawai'i is a Shanghai-based author. Many of you probably know she's very prolific. This is her 15th or 16th novel, and she has always been considered a serious contender for a Nobel Prize in literature, at least within China. And in her book, she really features Shanghainese style cooking, or shall we say more precisely, the Huaiyang style, or Jiangsu province style of cooking. So for Ge Liang is a professor of creative writing based at the Hong Kong Baptist University. And in her book, she features Cantonese style cooking. So that's the background of the two novels. So we always tell a student to state the thesis first before you go into any details. That's what I'm going to do today. So I do want to argue that the two novels, both of them, depict how the chefs utilize foodways to counter inherited traumas, both individual and the collective traumas. So, of course, they depict the chef's relationship with foodways differently, especially their different views of Chinese food heritage, right? So I want to first mention that I should have stated that earlier. Both of these novels are about chefs, about their life stories in 20th and 21st century Greater China. So I said I'm going to introduce two concepts, so that's what I'm going to do next. So first, I want to discuss this idea of post-memory. And post-memory is really an idea that has come out of Holocaust studies. But I think it's very helpful for us to use this concept today to talk about the connection between memory, history, and lived experiences. So basically, this is a definition by Marianne Hirsch. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I want to call your attention to the last part. This is really about how the generation after, which is the generation after the generation who actually experienced the traumas, to reimagine the past. So this is about imaginative investment, projection, creation. I will argue that that's exactly what the chefs do in the two novels. They use foodways as a tool, or food heritage as a tool, to reimagine the past, to counter the weight of traumas. That's the first concept. The second concept is really cultural heritage, or intangible cultural heritage. So here's an official authoritative definition by UNESCO, published in 2003, in which they state that the practices, representations, expressions, knowledge, skill, etc., that people recognize as their cultural heritage can be called intangible cultural heritage. That is to say, in contrast to physical objects, traditional definition of cultural heritage might be buildings, monuments, architectures. This is intangible. This is about representation, about knowledge, about practice, right? So that's one difference. Another difference is, of course, this is more grassroots, more dynamic and evolving. They do not necessarily represent the traditional definition of beauty or aesthetic or classic aesthetics. It's really about what people do with it, right? So then why is food called an intangible cultural heritage? Well, they embody shared cultural values. They can manifest in both preparation and consumption. They can be passed down from generation to generation. They can link members through space and time. Of course, they can show outsiders what the group identity or self-image is. That's why we think food can be also an intangible cultural heritage. So how do we apply these concepts in the analysis of these two novels? So as mentioned, the two novels are both about chefs and their life stories, basically. So I found it very interesting that both novels depict chefs who are orphans. So there are actually 3 chefs total in the two novels, but I'm going to focus on only the 2 of them. So one chef is Chef Chen Chen from Wang Yi's novel, The Knife and Words. Actually, Chen Chen is not his real name. He adopted a pseudonym for fear of political repercussions. So the second chef I'm going to focus on is Chef Rong Yishen, Chef Rong in the second book, Food is Heaven. So, and of course, his student, Chef Chen Wuju, also listed here, is also an orphan. But I want to show that Chef Chen Chen in the first novel and Chef Rong Yishen in the second novel also share something in common. They really lost the memory of their biological mother, or they don't really have a memory of their biological mother to start with. So I'll explain. Chef Chen Chen's mother is one of those so-called revolutionary martyrs who actually has been incarcerated and executed during the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s and the 70s because she dares to question the policy of those in power at the time. And Chef Chen Chen seems to have lost his memory before he is 6 years old. So he has no memory of his biological mother. So Chef Rong, on the other hand, his mother is a courtesan nun who gives birth to him in secret and who is presumably killed by his father's enemies. And actually, his mother's maid has to take Chef Rong, then an infant, to flee the dangers. So that's the backstory of their biological mothers. So the one subplot of the novel is really about how they try to recover the memory of their biological mother to find their mother. So you can say that they both chefs start their lives full of traumas already. And those personal traumas are set against the large background of historical traumas like wars, famines, political persecution, and things like that. But fortunately for them, they do have a standing father figure to help bring them up. That is their teacher in the kitchen, master chef. This is especially true of Chef Rong because Chef Rong's teacher emphasizes the cultural heritage, the noble lineage of this culinary art. So for Chef Rong, his teacher provides not just the trade or does not teach only the craft of cooking, but also the art. So we can say his master provides cultural heritage or food heritage as a sort of spiritual home or sanctuary for Chef Rong. So for Chef Chen Chen, in the first novel, that may not be so apparent. So it's interesting that some people after here might talk about the first novel, The Knife and Words, come out to me and saying, you know, this is not really about food. Food is not front and center in the first novel, but it plays also a very important role. So I'll explain. So for Chef Chen Chen, his teacher is not a famous master chef. His teacher is a itinerant cook who cooks for rural events like weddings, funerals, birthdays, and that sort of thing. And for Chef Chen Chen, he actually does not pretend or has no pretension to be the inheritor or heir of this grand noble heritage whatsoever. I think that also explains why the two authors, or how the two authors deploy food heritage differently. So for Ge Liang, the author of the second novel, Food is Heaven, he really emphasizes Chinese way of being that is distilled in cooking or in food ways. He really emphasized tradition as constant and continuing, unbreakable. And this is interesting in the novel when he has the cooks competing in a televised cooking show in order to 正本清源, so to speak, to clarify origins and strengthen the basics, basically, to restore orthodoxy, right? And he says elsewhere, not in this novel, but elsewhere, that the Chinese way of being is really in the food ways. And in this novel, he uses the cooking of lotus paste filling, which is a signature of Cantonese style dim sum, as you know. He uses that as a metaphor to explain what the Chinese way of being is, that is to ao or to simmer, to cook in low heat in order to make the perfect lotus paste filling. So that emphasizes Chinese people's resiliency, their capacity for suffering, etc. So in contrast, Wang Yi, for Wang Yi and the chef under her pen, Chef Chen Chen, the idea is really not to preserve and transmit noble lineage or cultural heritage. She emphasizes more the fluidity or change in food heritages and traditions. She is more interested in depicting the dignity of ordinary lived reality, and she promotes an aesthetic of the ordinary. This is very different from Ge Liang's novel. Ge Liang always has this fascination with a glamorous past, so to speak. So he depicts in the novel sumptuous meals, elaborate rituals, gardens, and luxurious furniture and that kind of thing. And I would say Ge Liang more mythologizes the past or cultural heritage or food heritage, whereas Wang Yi looks more forward. Really, for her, food matters because it helps to bring people together. It helps to help the chef navigate traumas in personal and collective lives. So I'm now going to move on to my conclusion. Remember, the title of my presentation is really to eat business. But I would say that at the end, we will see that the two authors, and the chefs under their pen, managed to turn the bitterness of the traumas into bittersweet post-memory. So it's a creative reinvestment of memory, right? And of course, there's the ethical question: who owns the memory? What then can they get out of the memory, right? Or what can they get out of the memorialization, to be precise? So I would say Ge Liang shows a more pre-modern understanding of food heritage as constant, and the chef's role or mission is really to keep these traditions whole. And for Wang Yi, this is really food as dynamic reality, and its main mission is to sustain individuals in their struggles against collective and individual traumas, inherited historical traumas as well. So how does this relate to food heritage or the topic of today's webinar? I would say first, food heritage can embody historical developments, but it can also be used as a tool to counter the weight or the heaviness of trauma, to counter official historiography, to allow previously silenced or marginalized voice to be heard and communities to be built. So after all, food waste is what we do as living human beings, as communities. They're not just recorded in elite style books by elite intellectuals. Thank you, and I would welcome any questions and comments. So I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you, Professor Fung. Two very interesting and very distinct presentations on different aspects of food. As we know, food studies has been absolutely booming across the disciplines, and many, like I think several of us here have turned from other academic interests into looking more closely at food. And, this, for historians at least, I don't think this was really possible until like the 90s, maybe the 1990s. Before that, if you were a food historian, you generally researched issues of supply and production, or perhaps famine and starvation, often the case, for Mao's China. But in the last 30 years, and particularly since the turn of the 21st century, there's been an increasing amount of scholarship on consumption, food consumption, and taste. Scholars of many different disciplines are coming to bring kind of new insights and interdisciplinary work themselves into the study of food. And I think it's very, very exciting. So I have some questions for both of you and sometimes individually. I'm curious, Thomas, I know you're working on cookbooks, and Jin, you talked about chefs. And as we all know, gendered food norms are very, very strong. So I'm wondering, is there a gendered food division in China in which chefs are generally men, but cookbooks are generally oriented towards women? And I know that may have changed over the course of Chinese history. Original cookbooks in Japan up until probably the late 19th century were oriented towards professional male cooks, and then it shifted very suddenly and radically in the 20th century to housewives. But a lot of the food history in Japan, on cookbooks and on gender to date, has focused a lot on women. So I wondered, if you can comment on different food gender norms, on whether there are, masculine canons versus feminine canons of taste and food. So that isn't, directly related to either of your presentations, but something that I thought of in connection with both of them. So maybe we can start off with that.
Jin, do you want to start?
Thomas, you can go first chronologically.
That's a very good point about the cookbooks and who they're written for. You are absolutely correct that there is a similar switch in China. In China, it happens in the 1930s. Before the 1930s, cookbooks are written for professional cooks, and these are always men. Home cooks could sometimes be women, but professional cooks were always men. And this is for a very, very simple reason. You need physical strength to be operating at the big stove. You need to have a certain amount of physical strength. You need to be tall, which I'm not. And I realized when I work in a professional kitchen that being 5'4" is a very serious liability. In a restaurant kitchen, almost always the person behind the stove will be a man. And if there are women, there will be in the cold room that's doing things like making noodles. That is a very, very common, you see it replicated in cooking schools as well. Very common division of labor. And I would say it's not a social division of labor as much as a recognition of physical realities. I've never heard people talk about, for example, that if men touch a certain, or women touch a certain dish, that the materials will be ruined. You do hear this in some culinary traditions. I personally have not heard it in a restaurant kitchen in China. Um, as far as cookbooks, the big switch happens when you have a change in the nature of the family. In particular, in the 1930s, when you have the rise of the small family, the nuclear family, that necessitates having somebody cooking at home as opposed to having a cook or having elderly relatives that are around doing this kind of housekeeping function. Um, that is when you have the rise of cookbooks written specifically for the housewife. So first you have the housewife who's in charge of the domestic duties of the nuclear family. Then you have the cookbooks that rise to serve the housewife. So the social change followed by the publishing change, followed by the cooking change. Um, and those are interesting because they are those step-by-step foolproof kind of cookbooks that tell you first you boil the water. Now, before you boil the water, put the water in a pan. This kind of, you have never been in a kitchen before, so we're going to tell you everything. The ones before that are written sort of notes from expert to expert. So you take the meat, you cook it till it's done, and you make it taste good, this kind of thing. So they're very, very short. The new generation of cookbooks, the ones that started in their 30s and still go to today, are written for the complete novice. So all of these things happen in a chain of events, and they end up with cookbooks that look like the cookbooks we have in the West. Over to
Okay.
Jim.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. That is fascinating. I know Thomas is an expert on Chinese food cookbooks. So I wanted to add to Thomas' comments is that in traditional Chinese society, there was this idea about what's elite, what's not, and that follows the division between manual labor and mental work. So for example, if you are a chef, you are considered lower class because you work in the kitchen, you work with your brain. But if you are, say, a gourmet writer, then you're high class. You work with your brain, right? So there's that division. So for people who write books, obviously they are authors, they are writers. So that's considered higher status. For a lot of Chinese history, really chefs did not produce books themselves. It's like people like Yuan Mei, the author of the recipe from the Garden Content, who write books, who comment on their cooking. So of course, that's not a good deal for women because in traditional Chinese society, women were not allowed into the public arena. They were supposed to stay home and take care of household. But of course, that's just one side of the picture because a lot of elite women did write poetry and form literary societies, did manage to publish, sometimes with male help or patronage, right? So I would say I echo Thomas by saying a lot of books were really produced by men, on food and cooking before the 20th century. So he mentioned the change to nuclear family and why that kind of cookbooks were necessary for women. I would also add around that time, there was a home economics movement. Cooking now was used as a metaphor for the nation. So you have to know how to take care of your family to breed strong children, strong citizens for the new republic. There's the symbolic meaning added to cooking that's so important for a modern woman, even if they do not work outside of home to learn how to cook, just to have, better kids, citizens of the republic and so forth. Actually, in my article, there was a article I did 3-4 years ago about female restaurant managers. These are women who actually do not cook themselves, but they are restaurant owners. They manage people who cook, or they can publish their writings on food that way. I thought that's a very interesting switch of power or flip of power because now they claim the cultural authority. They use sort of the cultural power to trump gender power, right? So I thought that's an interesting phenomenon in modern society. So I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's very interesting and mirrors what's happening in Japan, only it's happening in Japan a few decades earlier, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And in those new cookbooks at the time, there's also cosmopolitanization of the diet. So many of those cookbooks are teaching Japanese housewives how to cook Chinese foods and Western foods. It's interesting because Professor Feng, you talked about mythologization. And one of the ways that I think Japanese cuisine is mythologized today is this idea that the standard Japanese meal is ichiju sansai, 1 soup, 3 side dishes along with rice. But English language scholars have shown that that's not even possible for the majority of the Japanese until well after World War II. So I'm wondering if you can speak to other ways that I know, Dr. Feng, you were also talking about nostalgia and mythologization. So in what ways is that mythologization not really reflecting historical realities of how people ate? And is it based more on an urban eating profile versus what people in the rural areas ate? So I guess,
Sure.
how is food mythologized? And
Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for the great question. So in the novel, I discuss the mythologization really comes from trying to build up larger than life figures. For example, there was a high Qing official, retired high Qing official, who, of course, does not do any public work anymore, but he lives in this luxurious aristocratic household, and he supposedly has some mysterious origin story. His mother married a monkey or something like that, of that sorts. This was based on historical figure, but really the story is about, how he has this particular sharp taste or sensitivity to food. That's an inborn genius, right? They're almost like, I don't know, in DNA or something. So there's that. So more broadly speaking, the mythologization of foodways or history that happened in contemporary China is what I talked about in my book on food nostalgia. Is about historical restaurants. They want to sell their products to contemporary consumers, especially middle-class Chinese consumers. So they try to claim the kind of heritage they may not actually have. For example, there's a noodle, right? This bowl of noodle has been eaten and praised by the Qing emperor who visited Suzhou in a certain period. Or they try to recreate the so-called court food, like a banquet, supposedly the emperor had eaten when he visited Suzhou and so forth. This worked for contemporary consumers. For one thing, they had no idea what was actually eaten back in, I don't know, 18th century China. And for another, of course, this added glamour to the food they are eating today. They felt this pride, cultural pride, not just for the traditions, but also for themselves because they are connoisseurs of this kind of food. So this is a kind of distinction, right? Prestige that can be garnered by consuming this kind of product. So I'll stop here. Thomas may have more to add.
That's a really good background to mythologification, myth creating, because I think that's really the key to understanding food in China today. So much of it is myth making, which is an idea that I got from Jin's outstanding book, by the way. Um, the Mahan Quanxi, this famous banquet that you see in Hong Kong movies, for example, they make it sound like uh, the food that is eaten in the court, requires that it's not just lavish, that it's almost sort of superhuman in the things that are required to prepare it. And that it's the great test of the chef's skill. If you look at what they actually ate in the court, it was extremely simple and extremely low seasoning, a low level seasoning. And that was because they were eating not for pleasure, they were eating for nutrition. They were eating for longevity. They didn't eat like, French monarchs at Versailles. They ate like monks in a temple. Because that was the proper way to eat. And I think that this myth making, I'll be honest, it's what drew me into food studies because there's something so glamorous, something so exotic about Chinese food when you see it from the outside. But the closer you get to the inside, the more ordinary it seems, and the more you know down to earth the tradition actually is, particularly when you have somebody who's taking care of your diet, as you would have when you're in, for example, palace food or any of these other high-level traditions. It's actually very, very ordinary food. What makes it sort of beyond ordinary is you think about, for example, chicken in a Cantonese setting. The story is, and it is true, that somebody who knows Cantonese food If you take a bite of a very simply prepared chicken, they could tell you everything about this chicken. Was it a man or a woman? 公的母的. Was it a male or a female? How old was it? How was it raised? What was its diet? This is a very different sort of aesthetic. It's finding the beauty in subtlety rather than this image of a sort of an exotic, impossible to understand kind of tradition. It's actually the aesthetic of it is very, very down to earth. But the problem is that doesn't sell cookbooks. That doesn't sell the tradition. So this exotic tradition is something that really came out of the 1980s. It became a marketed product. And it's a sort of a self-exoticization that a lot of people will accept, including in China. So add to that, the sort of aesthetic that you get out of Michelin coming to China, the sort of aesthetic that comes out of online rating systems. What do people accept and what do they want from their food is always changing, but the culture itself really made a strong shift to a marketed product, and that has rapidly transformed the aesthetic.
So can I add one more thing? So I think Thomas made an excellent point about historical changes, with what is considered glamorous or exotic. So I also wanted to add, there are, of course, different ways of mythologizing history and mythologizing cultural heritage. One way, I think, is also to have a more gentry view of foodways, by which I mean they want to show their erudition. Like you can tell where this chicken is from or how is it raised, etc., etc. There's also that style of mythologizing Chinese foodways. So when everything else becomes overblown, you want to be the opposite of that. That's a way to earn distinction, right? You don't want to be as crude as those newly rich people who have no idea what they're eating and they just try to, take selfies and post it on TikTok or whatever. You want to show you actually are knowledgeable about this tradition. You want to show you are different. They could also do the opposite, eat something really humble, but can tell a lot of things about this particular dish. So there's also that.
Yeah, thank you. I use the term culinary capital to describe that kind of, food-based identity or knowledgeability about food. I don't know if I have time for more questions or you want to open it up. Have there been a lot of questions from the audience that we want
You want to ask one more? That's great.
Okay. Actually, so I wanted to ask Thomas another kind of Japan-related question. You talked about the 5 tastes, and of course, umami wasn't in there. And the elevation of umami to sort of the 6th taste has largely been a project of the Ajinomoto Corporation and has a lot to do with Japanese nationalism. But I'm just wondering, how umami is it accepted in Japan? Is it rejected or made fun of, or how does China think about umami?
That is a very fundamental question, actually. Xian in Chinese. There's been a shift, and it all comes back to MSG. I mean, obviously, people knew about Xian before, but I think there's been a rapid acceptance of MSG and then a gradual rejection of MSG. And so, you talk about umami being having a symbolic value. I think to Japanese cuisine, it does to Chinese as well, certainly. So the rediscovery of natural umami, I think, has been a slow burn sort of self-awakening among Chinese cuisine. So, if you go back again to early days, it was a very common thing. It remains a very common thing just to take a big spoonful of MSG and throw it into a fried dish. Now people are far less accepting of that. That is something you would do in a in a takeout dish. It's a sign of somebody who doesn't know how to properly develop umami. So, all of the tricks you would have in a Japanese kitchen using kombu, using seaweed, using oysters, using mushrooms in particular, these all exist in Chinese cuisine. And a lot of them got not forgotten so much, but it's just so much easier to use a prepared sauce. It's so much easier to use MSG or to use, another chemical agent or to replace umami with an adjacent taste like chilies or salt. But I think this is one of the returning skills, so half returning, half developing, uh, to new Chinese cuisine, particularly household cuisine, um, that you see in home kitchens more than anywhere else, because people don't like the idea of relying on MSG for this taste. But the way that you get the taste is is uh, is something it requires kitchen skill. But I think I'm trying to think of another way to say this. I think it shows a return of self-confidence of traditional Chinese culinary methods. You wouldn't see these in a restaurant, in an ordinary restaurant, because nobody knows what happens in the kitchen. And you don't really ask these questions in a restaurant setting. In a restaurant setting, you've got one question: is it delicious? How did it get delicious? It's not so important to me. Um, in a home setting, I think the standards are going to be very different. And this is generational. I would say house cooks of about age 40 and younger are really finding ways to make food delicious in a way that's also healthy. And it's related to food safety and all these other concerns. And umami is really sort of the front and center of that transformation.
Thank you. Should we go ahead and open it up to Q&A now, Jonathan?
Yeah, this is two fascinating talks and great questions. I have a lot of burning ones on my head, but we're past the top of the hour, which is time for people in the audience to ask questions. So there's been a few great questions posed in Q&A, but it's not too late. So if you're still in the room with something that is on the tip of your tongue, I guess in this case your finger, please write it in the Q&A, and we'll pass those along. So and maybe Alvin Yoshida writes, how are 5 flavors cyclical? How does one flavor relate or flow into the next? Is it like a color wheel? Do neighboring flavors complement and opposites contrast? Probably
That is a question I'm not particularly well placed to answer. I was reading about the 5 flavors from a book called the Huangdi Neijing. It's the book of medical theory that's really a compilation of medical theory. And I spent the past few weeks trying to answer exactly that question. It's a very hard one to do. You see, for example, in medical use, so different medicines also have a nature, um, a hot nature or a spicy nature or a cooling nature or whatever. Um, you would think, or I would think, that if you have a condition that's brought on from an excess, for example, of sour, for example, that you would find the opposite on the wheel and the medicine would be something that counters sour. That, for me, is kind of the common sense approach to it. It's actually much more complex than that. So if you have too much sour, part of the medicine might be sour in nature. But then you've got cooling sour and heating sour. You've got medical conditions that relate to the top or bottom of the body, all of these different things that go into it beyond the sort of the color wheel approach. Um, so it's not they are cyclical in the sense that each flavor relates to an organ of the body, and that one flavor or one taste, pardon me, will feed that organ, will travel through that organ, that particular organ likes it, that organ, or that system. So you've got the spleen, you've got the heart, you've got the liver, you've got the kidneys, and then you've got the lungs. Those are the five. Not the physical organ, but the system in the Chinese medical theory, that certain tastes will be very beneficial, certain will be harmful, but the particular relation is actually much more complicated than just one feeds to two, two feeds to three, that relationship. That also is something that I've heard different medical practitioners speak differently about. So this is a very long way of saying it's more complex than I can explain, and it's definitely more complex than I can understand.
Can I chime in a little bit here? I think
Please.
Thomas, you already mentioned that this is really food, as part of the whole universe. Like your foodway is microcosm of the universe, and that's how you deal with diet and health in traditional Chinese thinking. So I just want you to add that the 5 flavors also correspond to the 5 phases. 金木水火土五行. So there's the metal, there's the earth, there's the water, there's a fire, and there's the wood. So according to traditional Chinese cosmology, these 5 phases also have this control and foster relation, 生 and 克. So for example, 金生水, the metal would give rise to water. And then, of course, 火克金, the fire can control or conquer metal. So this is kind of mysterious to modern thinkers, but the idea is really the flavors and the organ systems correspond to these forces in the whole universe. So if you change something, you change the other. So there is a holistic view about health and about food. And of course, it's up to experts like dietitians and medical doctors in traditional Chinese society to decide on what's the appropriate food to eat at a certain moment in your life, right? So Thomas already mentioned the cooling and the heating effects of food. So in the summer, you really want to eat something cool like cucumbers. That's considered a cooling vegetable. But that does not mean you can overindulge. If you eat too much cooling food in the summer, like too much watermelons, for example, that could also cause a problem. So there's this ever-evolving cycle of things, right? The yin and the yang. Too much yin leads to yang. Too much yang leads to yin. So that's the same idea and concept. So hope that helps a little bit.
I just wanted to make a quick comment too. I've done a little bit of work on the macrobiotic diet in Japan, which is based very much on Chinese traditional ideas about eating. But one of the things that early macrobiotics did that they've kind of phased out now was the use of phrenology and like facial shapes and characteristics to determine food prescriptions. Was that also used in China?
I'm not aware of that, but I know for a traditional Chinese medical doctor, they do 4 things, 望闻问切. So they look at your complexion or your facial and other features, physical features outside. 闻 is to listen to you, how you describe your symptoms or how you let out sounds. 问 is to ask you questions. Or 闻 can also be to smell, right? To get a sense of your odor, body odor. And 切 is really to take your pulse in order to make sure that they have the correct diagnosis and to prescribe something for you. So I guess to looking at your face is part of the picture, but I don't think it's the same as 看相 or read your facial features to tell your fortune. That's a completely different category of practice.
Great. Well,
Really, what
Go ahead. No, no.
all of the medical theory, all of the medical literature, especially the early ones, they all emphasize balance. And so, where conditions come from is being out of balance. And so, you would use the cyclical approach of overcoming to return to a balance, to a state of balance.
That's great. Got lots of good questions rolling here. Maybe I'll do two questions at once, one for Thomas and one for Jean. I think both questions are asking you to expand the scope of what you talked on and kind of look at something a little bit larger. So for Thomas, from Jonathan White, yes, can you talk a little bit more about the social meanings of the word way? So kind of maybe and more general what that means. And for Jean, we have an anonymous question, but the anonymous attendee is an excellent talk, and I really appreciated your incorporations of post-memory and intangible heritage. Were there other novels or short stories you came across that you were considering including in this research? And if yes, could you please briefly describe how they'll fit into your research? So Thomas, you want to go first?
Very quickly, that's the third use of wei. You hear it used today in terms of 品味. You have 味道, you have 品味. 品味 just means taste in the sense of social taste. He has good taste. 味道 is the physical taste. 本味 is the first one that I talked about, or 真味, which is more of an essence, an unchangeable essence. Where I found it interesting is the idea that a cultured person, a civilized person, eats in a certain way. That, and you do hear this quite often today, but it's much older than that a person who has good taste will eat very simply. A person who has undeveloped taste will like, really strong taste, really salty, really oily, a lot of chilies, that this reflects something about the nature of the person. The reason, this was my original question, why do certain people crave certain foods? And I had expected, because you hear popularly people say, this person has a spicy personality, so that's why he likes spicy food, that it's related to something, something in the person that you crave these foods. If you go through the medical literature, there's nothing like this. And that was my surprise, but that was the original reason that I got into the question of why would you want certain foods at a certain time? And where it does come out is actually more in this sense of moral cultivation. Why do you like complex tastes? Would be the same reason that you like complex music or complex literature. You've developed a taste for it, and the process of developing a taste for the right food is parallel to developing a taste for morality, for literature, for learning, for culture. So food is in a sense, the aesthetics of what kind of food you like, eating like an adult, basically, is very similar to the aesthetics of becoming a civilized or a cultivated person. And those both use the same sense of way, of taste. And it's just a coincidence that taste would also have those two meanings in English. That, I think, is really the fundamental axis.
Oh, Jean, you need to unmute yourself. Sorry.
So thanks for the question. I think this is a question about literature. And I will confess, this is fairly new research project for me, not on food itself, but on the connection between food and post-memory. The connection between food and memory has been talked about quite a bit already, I think. And I have taught a a food course that incorporates literature or literary works. So I'll give a few examples. One is 美食家 or The Gourmet by Lu Wenfu. That's a novella that's already been translated into English. So if you're interested, you can read that. And there's a novel that I want to read, but I haven't yet. This came out in 2022 called 灶王传奇 by this author called Li Hao. So that book, the title means The Legend of the Kitchen God. So I wanted to read it, but I haven't done that yet. But I do want to explore furthermore the connection between post-memory and the food. So it just so happens the two novels I discussed today have that theme in common. So this really is about how later generations deal with the traumas their parents or even older generations experience and how they incorporate that into their lives by using food as a tool. So of course, there are lots of classics in modern Chinese literature even about food. So Thomas already talked about pre-modern food writings, lots of them. In modern Chinese literary canon, you can also try to check out books by Wang Zengqi. This is a famous author and a recognized gourmet. He passed away already, but he wrote lots of essays and short stories, not a novel on food itself. So he's one of those cultured, erudite, literati gourmet writer, so to speak. And of course, if you want to expand your reading list to Hong Kong and Taiwan, there are also lots of good writings like Cailan in Hong Kong. And I've read lots of essays by Tang Lu Sun and by Lu Yaodong. They did not write novels or short stories, but there are lots of interesting essays written around food. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, we're just down to the last like a couple minutes. I guess if I can take the liberty to maybe ask a small question at the end, Thomas, you're talking about the banquet for the Chulzi, the kind of the even the gods are eating, and Jean, for you, it's I really liked how it's not necessarily food that sustains us, but it's like food heritage that the heritage itself. I'm wondering, thinking about the five senses, is there any does food trump writing, and not trump the person, but the verb is like the defining characteristic of being a human being or being a being in this world, right? Even after people die, right? Your ancestors, you communicate with them, or not communicate with them, you offer them food, right? It's like even after you die, you need to eat. It's a so and maybe this even there's another anonymous question about how we use all of this in the classroom or teaching. So I'm just wondering, in both of your experience in bringing food to an audience, is it too much to say that like food is the most fundamental thing of being a person? Is it?
For a Chinese person, yes. We have that saying, right? We have that saying, 民以食为天. Food is the most fundamental thing for the common people. Everyone eats, right? And we are what we eat.
So yeah, should we be like, I guess, should we be teaching China like should food history be kind of China 101 in some ways? Is it like a
Yes. Yes. No, I mean, without exaggeration. I think that, we often, I mean, this is how I came to the question. I've been here since the early 90s, on and off. And the food has changed dramatically since the early 90s in China. The question that always comes up with food is it authentic? Is this authentic Chinese food? And now I'm very close to this sort of organic growing, natural food, these kind of groups, and they always want me to be on their webcasts. But I've also had health problems that came from eating Chinese food, particularly in the north where it's very salty. And so the question of what is real? What is real Chinese food? What is if we're going to use this kind of language, what's the essence of Chinese food? You know, I went to cooking school in Sichuan, and I learned a kind of Sichuan cooking that is very far from the Feiyi, the ICH, international, the cultural heritage tradition, but it's the kind that consumers want because it's fast to make, and it's the kind that restaurant bosses like because you can substitute ingredients, and you know you can uh, sort of operate a kitchen efficiently and cheaply. So even then, you know, is what you're learning in cooking school real Chinese food? Well, kind of yes, kind of no. Is you know, is the standard for authenticity food that we're having in a village? Well, that makes sense, but it also kind of doesn't. Is the Michelin restaurant in Shanghai going to be our standard? Well, that doesn't make sense because we're making our food to serve the Michelin format. So this whole question of authenticity and essence is something that has been plaguing me for now decades. And what it came to for me, particularly when you start reading historical literature and you see that people historically, not just what they ate, but what they wanted from their food and how they thought about their food, is always changing and is very different from anything that we would regard as essentially Chinese food now. What it really comes to for me, how I got to this question is, what is Chinese food? It's not a dish. It's not a preparation. It's not a technique. It's not a taste. It is an approach to food. And when you see that cultural approach to food, you realize, as Jin so nicely put it, it's the everything that is essential to Chinese culture is in food. So it's not just that Chinese people like food more than other people do, although they certainly like food very much, but that the essence of Chinese culture is reflected in food. Food isn't something that you eat at the end of the day. It's who you are. And in a way that's much more profound than just what's my identity or what did my parents like to cook for me. It's a mirror of the essence of Chinese culture, and you know, this idea that it connects to health, that it connects to time, that it connects to your moral center, that it connects to your development as a human being. This is what I think we have to see when we look at food, and this would make it a perfectly good way, an ideal way to understand Chinese culture, because everything in Chinese culture is related to food, and not just in an Epicurean sense.
That sounds like an excellent note to end this webinar. It's a I'd like to thank our two presenters, Thomas and Jean, and our respondent Nancy, for a really lively and stimulating and, I say, delicious discussion. I should find something. But yeah, thank you all. For anyone in attendance, if you're not on the mailing list for our center, ccs@hawaii.edu, that will get you on the mailing list to learn about all our webinars. I think there are six more this semester, so feel free to come back. But thank you all for being here, and thank you to our presenters and respondents. Aloha.
Thank you for
Adios.
having me. Thank
Yeah.
you.